The first thing I burned was the bread. Not metaphorically, though there was plenty of that to come, but literally, physically, catastrophically burned. The smell hit before the smoke did. Something thick and wrong curling up from the stone oven like an accusation, black at the edges and hollow in the middle, a perfect representation of how I felt standing in the kitchen of Velmore Pack's great house at 6:45 in the morning, wearing an apron that belonged to someone at least 4 inches taller than me, and holding a wooden spoon I had no idea how to use properly. I was not supposed to be here. That thought repeated itself on a loop as I set the ruined loaf on the counter and stared at it. I was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be at the diplomatic table. I had spent 3 years studying pack law, treaty language, the history of the Northern Territories, and their complicated relationship with the Central Alpha Courts. I had memorized the Velmore Accords, the Greythorn Clauses, the entire contested boundary documentation going back 6 generations. I had practiced my opening statements in front of a mirror so many times that my roommate had started sleeping with earplugs. I had prepared. What I had not prepared for was the coordinator's assistant, a thin, harried young man with ink-stained fingers, and the look of someone who had not slept in 3 days, grabbing my file from the wrong pile and handing it to the household director with the cheerful announcement that the new kitchen consultant had finally arrived. And I, exhausted from 2 days of travel, operating on approximately 4 hours of sleep and 1 granola bar, had not corrected him fast enough. That was 4 hours ago. Now I was here, and the bread was ruined. And somewhere in this enormous, stone-cold manor, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs was waking up. Velmore was not what I had imagined. I had imagined something severe and military, all straight lines and stone corridors, the aesthetic of power displayed without apology. What I found instead was something older and stranger, a house that had grown rather than been built, rooms added across centuries so that the hallways didn't quite line up, ceilings varied in height from one door to the next, and every surface carried the fingerprints of time. Tapestries that had faded to suggestion, floors worn smooth by generations of feet, windows so thick with old glass that the morning light came through them warped, bent, turning the courtyard outside into something softer than reality. It should have felt cold. Instead, it felt like a held breath. The kitchen itself was enormous and slightly chaotic, which did not help me. There were 3 other staff members who had arrived by 7, a young woman named Petra, who chopped vegetables with terrifying efficiency and spoke in short, complete sentences. An older man called Dog, who managed the fire and apparently communicated exclusively through eyebrow movements. And a girl, 17 at most, named Sable, who kept glancing at me with the particular expression of someone watching a person stand too close to a cliff's edge. "You've worked in a kitchen before," Petra said. It was not a question. "I've eaten in a kitchen before," I said, which was the most honest answer I could offer. Dog's left eyebrow climbed approximately 1/2 inch. I decided this meant disapproval. "The morning meal for the Alpha and his council goes out at 8 sharp," Petra said, returning to her work. "Eggs, cured meats, the bread, which is now ash, roasted root vegetables, and the broth." "The broth," I repeated. "It's been simmering since midnight. You don't need to touch the broth." I looked at the large pot on the back of the fire. It smelled extraordinary, deep and herbed, and somehow warm in a way that felt personal, like someone had put something of themselves into it. "Who made the broth?" A small pause. Sable looked at her hands. Petra's knife stopped for exactly 1 beat before resuming. "The Alpha made it," Dog said. His voice was low and unexpectedly gentle for someone with forearms like carved wood. "He does, most mornings, when he can't sleep." I absorbed this information quietly. I managed the eggs, that much I could do, scrambled, which was generous to my abilities. But the previous kitchen consultant had apparently made them the same way, and no one seemed inclined to argue with continuity. The root vegetables were already half prepared. Petra guided me through the finishing without making me feel entirely useless. which I suspected took considerable restraint on her part. Sable quietly remade the bread, working fast, with the particular silence of someone cleaning up after a disaster without wanting to draw attention to it, and it came out golden and fragrant in a way mine never would have. By 7:58, the tray was assembled. It looked right. It smelled right. The broth steamed gently. The eggs were pale gold and soft. The bread had a crust that sounded hollow when Sable tapped it, which she told me in a whisper was a good sign. And then Petra said, "Someone needs to carry it to the east dining room." The silence that followed had a specific texture, not the silence of people who didn't hear. The silence of people who heard perfectly well and were each, individually, deciding that this particular task should fall to someone else. I looked at the tray. I looked at the hallway. "I'll do it," I said, mostly because I had already ruined the bread, and it seemed only fair that I face whatever consequences came from this morning personally. The east dining room was not difficult to find. The house had a logic to it. Once you accepted that the logic was emotional rather than architectural, you moved toward warmth, toward light, toward the sound of low voices, and eventually you arrived somewhere that mattered. The door was partially open. I could hear two voices inside, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who had known each other long enough to remove all unnecessary words. I pushed the door open with my hip, the tray balanced in both hands, and I saw him. I had formed an image of the Alpha King from the documentation I'd read. Age 32. Ascended to leadership at 26 under contested circumstances. Known for decisive action. Territorial disputes resolved with unusual efficiency, and a reputation among the southern courts as someone who did not accommodate inconvenience. The files had included a formal portrait, formal clothes, formal expression, the kind of photograph taken by someone who wants to communicate authority and succeeds completely. The man sitting at the end of the long oak table was not that photograph. He was reading something, a folded document held in one hand, his elbow resting on the table with the ease of someone who had never needed to perform posture. Dark hair, slightly disordered, the kind of face that would be handsome in a formal portrait and was, in person, something considerably more complicated. Not beautiful exactly, but specific. The way landscapes are specific. The way you remember a place not because it was perfect, but because it was itself entirely. A scar ran along his jaw on the left side, faint and old. The kind of thing that stopped being remarkable to him long ago. He looked up when I entered. Gray eyes. Not cold. I had expected cold. Something steadier than that. Something that looked at you and took its time. "You're new," he said. "Yes," I said. I set the tray on the table. The other man in the room, older, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in formal settings, watched me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Curious, maybe. Or careful. "Where's Marin?" the Alpha King asked, not unkindly, just directly. "I'm not entirely sure," I said, which was true. I had gathered from context and fragments of overheard conversation that Marin was the previous kitchen consultant, and that her absence was recent and not entirely explained. I had not gathered why. He looked at the tray. He looked at me. His gaze moved to the bread. Sable's bread, golden and perfect. And then to the eggs. And then back to me. And I had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being assessed in a way that was not unkind, but was absolutely thorough. "The broth is mine," he said. "The rest is yours?" "Technically, it's a collaborative effort," I said. The silver-haired man made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The Alpha King said nothing for a moment. Then, "What's your name?" "Grace," I said. "Grace," he repeated. A flat repetition, like he was placing it somewhere he could find it later. "Do you know what you're doing?" I thought about the burned bread, still cooling on the kitchen counter. I thought about the 3 years of diplomatic study I had somewhere in a bag in a room I hadn't yet properly located. I thought about the fact that I was standing in the wrong room, doing the wrong job, in a house where the Alpha King made his own broth at 3 a.m. because he couldn't sleep. Not entirely, I said. But I'm good at learning. He looked at me for one more moment. That steady, unhurried look. And then he reached for the bread and broke it, and the sound of the crust splitting was clean and sharp in the quiet room. He didn't send me away. That, I would later understand, was the beginning of everything. Nobody told me officially that I was staying. That was the thing about Velmore. Decisions happened in the negative space between words. No one said you're hired and no one said leave, and so I remained, moving through the house like something the tide had brought in, and no one had decided yet whether to keep. I was given a room on the second floor, narrow and north-facing, with a window that looked out over the back courtyard where the horses were kept. I was handed a second apron, this one the right length. Petra showed me where the dry stores were kept without being asked. Dag moved the heaviest pots to the lower shelves without commenting on my height. I was beginning to understand, how this house expressed acceptance. Not through declaration, through quiet adjustment. I still had not corrected the mistake. This was the thing that kept me awake that first night, staring at the ceiling while the horses shifted in the courtyard below, and the wind came down from the northern ridges with a sound like something being carefully unfolded. I had the file. My actual credentials were in the bag under the bed. 3 years of documentation, recommendation letters, the official seal from the Diplomatic Council. All I had to do was take them to someone with authority and explain that there had been an error and that I was, in fact, here to sit at a table and talk about border law, not to produce breakfast. The problem was that I kept not doing it. I told myself it was tiredness. I told myself it was the wrong moment, that I'd find the right person tomorrow, that the diplomatic proceedings hadn't formally begun yet, and there was still time. These were all partially true, and mostly excuses, and I knew it. What was actually true was harder to say out loud, even to myself. That something in this house had caught me, and I wasn't ready to let go of it yet. The broth. The warped window glass. The way the Alpha King had broken the bread without ceremony, and eaten it like it was something he was grateful for, rather than something he was owed. I fell asleep thinking about gray eyes, and was up again at 5:30 to prove something to myself about eggs. The second morning went better. Not well. I want to be precise about that. But better, which in a kitchen means the distance between disaster and something edible. Petra arrived to find that I had already started the vegetables, and had not set fire to anything, which she acknowledged with a single nod that I was learning to read as equivalent to high praise. Sable showed me how to judge the bread by touch rather than by time, pressing her fingers gently into the dough and explaining, with the patient tone of someone who has always understood things intuitively, and is now trying to translate that understanding into language, that you were feeling for resistance, for the dough pushing back against you just enough. "It'll tell you when it's ready," she said. "That's not very precise," I said. She smiled. "No, but it's accurate." Dog made a sound from across the kitchen that I was beginning to interpret as agreement. By the third morning, I had learned where everything lived, which was less about memorizing locations and more about understanding the logic of the kitchen. Why the heavier tools hung closest to the fire. Why the herbs were organized by what you reached for in urgency versus what you reached for with intention. Why the good knives were kept in a separate block on the far counter and never, under any circumstances, used for anything other than their designated purpose. The kitchen had a philosophy. Once I understood the philosophy, the geography came naturally. What I couldn't find was a natural moment to announce that I didn't belong there. On the fourth day, I met the council. They arrived mid-morning. 4 of them. Plus the silver-haired man I had seen in the dining room that first day, whose name turned out to be Aaron, and whose role was something between advisor and conscience. The kind of position that doesn't have a clean title, because the person in it refuses to be reduced to one. They came into the kitchen not because they needed anything from it, but because the kitchen, in Velmore, was apparently a kind of social crossroads. The room you passed through, the room you paused in, the room where conversations happened between the official conversations. I was attempting pastry. I want to note, for the record, that no one had asked me to attempt pastry. I had seen the butter and the flour and a handwritten recipe card tucked into a crack in the wall. Someone's notation, faded at the edges. And something had moved in me that I couldn't immediately explain. Some combination of stubbornness and the particular kind of determination that emerges when you've been failing at things for 4 days and need to succeed at something. The council watched me work with varying degrees of interest. "You're the new kitchen person," said one of them. A broad-shouldered woman named Calla, with close-cropped dark hair and the direct eye contact of someone who had spent years in rooms where blinking first was a tactical concession. "Apparently," I said. "Where did you train?" A pause. Petra's knife did not slow. Dag did not look up from the fire, but I felt the quality of the room's attention shift, just slightly, the way air changes before weather arrives. "I studied for several years," I said, which was entirely true and entirely evasive, and seemed to satisfy Calla, who lost interest and turned to argue with Aaron about something involving the eastern boundary maps. Aaron, however, glanced at me over Calla's shoulder with an expression I couldn't decode. Not suspicious. Something more like recognition, as though I had said something in a language he hadn't expected me to know. I didn't see the Alpha King again until the 6th day. Not absence, exactly. I was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, a pressure that the house carried differently depending on his mood, rooms that seemed to organize themselves around his route through them. The kitchen staff spoke about him in a matter-of-fact way that told me more than any formal briefing could have. He took his evening meal late, often alone. He went to the stables when he needed to think. He didn't shout, but silences from him were differentiated. There were thinking silences, and there were disappointed silences, and learning to tell them apart was, apparently, a key survival skill for life at Velmore. The 6th morning he came to the kitchen. Not for the tray. The tray went out at 8, as always. He came at 6:30 while the broth was still being prepared, and stood at the far counter with a cup of something dark and looked at the room the way I was beginning to understand he looked at most things, with the full weight of his attention and without apology for it. I was making the bread. My 3rd proper attempt. The first had been Sable's rescue project. The second had been edible but dense. This one, I pressed my fingers in the way she had shown me and felt something push back, alive and patient. "You've been practicing," the Alpha King said. "Every morning," I said. He was quiet for a moment. I kept my eyes on the dough, not because I was avoiding looking at him, but because the dough required it. And there was something about that. Being occupied with something real, something immediate, something that required your hands, that made the conversation feel less like being assessed and more like just 2 people in the same room in the early morning. "Marin had been cooking since she was 8, he said, not unkindly, just as fact. "I'm aware I'm not Marin," I said. "No," he said. "You're not." I put the loaf in the oven. I set the time in my head the way Sable had shown me, not by the clock, but by the smell, waiting for the moment the kitchen shifted from raw to golden. I turned around, finally, and he was still there, watching me with that unhurried look that I was slowly accepting as his default mode of being. "Why are you still here?" he asked. It was not a cruel question. It was a real one. The kind asked by someone who has learned that the honest questions are the ones that sound blunt. I thought about the file under my bed. I thought about the diplomatic credentials, and the 3 years of preparation, and the coordinator's assistant with the wrong pile of papers. I thought about Sable's hands in the dough, and Dag's single approving eyebrow, and the way this house, in 6 days, had rearranged something in me I hadn't known needed rearranging. "I'm not completely sure yet," I said. He considered that. Then he nodded, once, slow, and left. The bread, when I pulled it out, was the best thing I had made since arriving. The crust sang when I tapped it. Sable looked at it with something close to pride. I stood there, flour on my hands, and thought about the question he'd asked, and the answer I hadn't quite given, and felt something tighten in my chest that wasn't fear and wasn't quite hope yet. something in between, something that needed more time. The diplomatic proceedings began on a Tuesday. I know this because I heard them, not the content, but the sound of them, the particular register of voices that rises through stone walls when important people are disagreeing with great formality. The East Wing had been rearranged for it. Long tables, formal seating, the kind of spatial organization that signals to everyone present that what happens in this room has weight and consequence. I caught glimpses through half-open doors when I carried trays. Delegates in territorial colors, stacks of documents bound in cord, Aaron moving between groups with the quiet efficiency of someone fluent in every flavor of tension. I recognized the language of those rooms. I had studied it for 3 years. I turned and carried my empty tray back to the kitchen. This was the new shape of my days. Early mornings with flour on my hands, the broth always on the fire, the rhythm of the kitchen settling into my body the way rhythms do when you stop fighting them and start listening instead. Petra had stopped watching me with the careful expression of someone waiting for a second disaster. Dag had moved to full sentences on occasion, short ones, the kind that carried a lot of weight and very few words, which I was coming to understand was its own form of respect. Sable brought me tea in the mid-morning without being asked, setting it near my elbow with the silent attentiveness of someone who notices things and acts on them without needing acknowledgement. I was becoming, against all reasonable expectation, part of something. And still the file sat under the bed. It was Aaron who found me out. Of course it was. I had been carrying a secondary tray to the small study adjacent to the council room. Someone needed tea and documentation, and apparently those things traveled together, when I rounded a corner and nearly collided with him. He caught the tray before anything spilled, with the reflexes of someone who had been in enough important rooms to know that spills at the wrong moment have consequences. And then he looked at me with that expression I had been cataloging since the first day. Recognition. Patience. The look of someone waiting for a conversation to catch up to where he already is. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a question. I walked with him. He took us to a small room off the east corridor. Not an office exactly. More like a room that had been a library once and still remembered it. Shelves along every wall. A table with 2 chairs angled toward a window that looked out over the ridge. The afternoon light came through at a low angle, turning everything amber and unhurried. He sat. I sat. "You know," he said, "the diplomatic liaison from the Southern Council was expected to arrive 8 days ago." I said nothing. She was described in the intake documentation as a woman with fair hair, early 30s, trained in pack law and treaty negotiation. He paused. There was a filing error. Her paperwork ended up in the household services queue. Still nothing from me. The amber light moved slightly. "She's been making bread every morning," Aaron said, almost to himself, which suggests either a remarkable commitment to the role or an extraordinary amount of patience. "Both," I said finally. "Probably both." He looked at me. Not with judgment. I want to be clear about that. With something considerably more complicated, which was interest mixed with the particular kind of care that comes from long proximity to someone who carries a great deal of responsibility and has learned to be careful about who gets close to it. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked. It was the same question the Alpha King had asked. Different angle. I had been turning it over for 8 days, and had not yet found an answer that was fully honest, and also fully explainable. So I tried for the parts that were both. When I arrived, I was exhausted, and I missed the correction window, I said. And then I stayed because I paused. The kitchen needed someone, and I needed somewhere to be that wasn't the place I'd prepared so hard for. Aaron was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse moved in the courtyard below, hooves on stone. "The place you'd prepared so hard for," he repeated slowly. "And how was that place the last few years?" I looked at the shelves. Rows of spines, titles in several languages, the accumulated patience of years of reading. "Rigid," I said. "Procedural, correct in a way that left very little room for being wrong." "And kitchens?" "Kitchens are constantly wrong," I said. "And then you adjust. and then something works, and it feels like yours in a way that treaties never quite do. He nodded. Long and slow, the way he seemed to process things, not with speed, but with completeness. I'll need to tell him, he said. I know, I said. He doesn't appreciate deception. Another pause, and I noticed he used the word deception carefully, watching to see how I received it. I know that too, I said, but it wasn't. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I was just not correcting a mistake fast enough. Sometimes those are the same thing, Aaron said, not unkindly. Sometimes, I agreed. He stood. I stood. He looked at me for one more moment with that expression that I had finally, in this room, managed to decode. He was deciding something. Not about my guilt or my credentials or the filing error. Something slower than that. Something about whether I was worth the complication. I'll speak to him tonight, he said. You should be prepared for a conversation tomorrow. He left. I stood at the amber window for a long moment, watching the ridge, and then I went back to the kitchen, because there was still the evening meal to manage, and standing in small rooms having feelings was, I was learning, a luxury this house didn't often permit. The conversation came the next morning. Not in the east dining room, not in any formal space. He found me in the kitchen at 6, the way he sometimes did, except this time Petra and Dog and Sable had been given errands that took them elsewhere, and the absence of the usual bodies in the room had its own significance. He stood at the far counter. I stood at the near one, my hands in dough that I had not consciously decided to begin, but had started anyway, because having something to do with your hands when you're waiting for a hard conversation is not cowardice, it's survival. Aaron told me, he said. I know, I said. Silence. The fire breathed. Outside, the morning was gray and low, the kind of sky that holds its weather close, not yet decided about what it intends. 3 years of pack law, he said. Treaty negotiation. You know the Velmore Accords. Forwards and backwards, I said, and most of the contested annotations. Why are you in my kitchen? I turned to face him, because this question deserved that, at minimum. He was watching me without the hardness I had half expected. Not softness either, but something real. Something that wanted an actual answer, rather than a managed one. I came here prepared for a version of this place that I'd constructed entirely from documents, I said. And then I arrived, and the documents weren't wrong exactly, but they were flat. And I ended up here, and the kitchen was... I searched for the right word, and found an honest one rather than an elegant one. Loud. In the way that live things are loud, even when they're quiet. And I didn't want to leave it yet. He looked at me for a long time. The gray eyes doing their particular work, that slow, thorough attention that felt less like judgment and more like being genuinely seen, which was somehow more difficult to withstand. The bread this week, he said finally. Better, I said. Yes. The edge of something, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. It is. He was quiet for another moment. Then, the liaison position is still empty. The proceedings started without you, which means someone has been doing your job badly for 8 days, and we're behind on the Eastern Boundary discussion. He straightened. You'll join the council table this afternoon. And the kitchen? I asked, before I could stop myself. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Surprised, maybe, or something that had surprised him, and that he was still catching up to. The kitchen will still be here, he said. Mornings are mornings. He left. I pressed my hands into the dough and felt it push back, alive and warm and resistant in exactly the right way. Sable appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later, took one look at my face, and quietly put the kettle on. How bad? She asked. Not bad, I said, and meant it, in a way I hadn't expected to mean anything for quite a while. She nodded, satisfied, and said nothing else. Outside, The gray sky finally made up its mind and let the rain begin, soft and even against the old glass, bending the courtyard into something gentler than itself. The council table was nothing like I had imagined. I want to say that carefully, because I had imagined it in considerable detail across 3 years of preparation, and the imagination had been precise and confident, and almost entirely wrong. I had pictured formality, rigid seating, procedural language, the kind of meeting that runs on agenda items and timed contributions, and the particular coldness of people performing competence at each other. What I found instead was something more like controlled chaos, dressed in formal clothes, voices overlapping, documents passed without ceremony, the kind of disagreement that has been running long enough to develop its own shorthand. Calla was the loudest, which surprised no one. She argued in complete paragraphs, gesturing with her hands in a way that seemed unconscious, her body participating in her reasoning without her permission. Beside her sat a quiet, precise man named Dorian, whose contributions came rarely, but landed with the weight of things that had been considered from every angle before being released into the room. Across the table, a woman named Isolde represented the Far Eastern territories, with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned that the appearance of no preference is itself a position. And at the head of the table, Adrian. I had not yet used his name, even in my own mind. He had been the Alpha King or him or the man with the gray eyes and the early morning broth, which was a long way to refer to someone internally, but had felt safer than the intimacy of a name. Sitting across from him at a working table, with documents between us and a room full of people paying attention to things other than the two of us, I used it once, quietly, just to see how it felt. Adrian. It fit him in a way that formal titles didn't, something plain and functional, a word that didn't try too hard. My first contribution came 40 minutes in, during a stalemate over the Eastern boundary language that had apparently been running for 3 days. The dispute was, on the surface, about measurement, whose methodology for determining territorial markers was considered authoritative, and whether historical precedent or current occupation determined boundary rights when the two conflicted. Underneath the surface, which was where the actual dispute lived, it was about which pack had been more deeply wronged by an agreement made 60 years ago by leaders who were no longer alive to be held accountable for it. I had read this exact disagreement. Not in these terms, the terms had evolved, but the underlying structure was in the Velmore Accords, annotated in the margin by someone who had clearly seen it coming. The 60-second session resolution, I said. The room shifted. 7 faces turned toward me with varying expressions. Calla's openly curious, Dorian's carefully neutral, Isolde's fractionally interested. The language in the 60-second session included a provisional clause. I said, that was never formally retired. It states that in cases of contested historical precedent, a joint survey, representatives from both parties, independent methodology, supersedes both individual claims. I paused. Neither side is wrong about their own measurement. The clause exists precisely because both could be right and still be in conflict. A silence. The useful kind. Dorian reached for a document, found a page, read it. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. The slight, involuntary settling of someone who has just found solid ground. She's right, he said simply. Calla stared at me with an expression that was reassessing something. Isolde wrote something down. At the head of the table, Adrian looked at me with the gray eyes and said nothing, which I was learning was not the same as having nothing to say. The session moved forward. Afterward, in the corridor, Calla fell into step beside me. You've been making breakfast, she said. Yes. And you knew the 60-second session resolution. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone reorganizing information. You're strange, she said finally, without apparent judgment. But useful, both simultaneously. That's rarer than it sounds. Thank you, I said, deciding to take it as a compliment. She nodded once, abruptly, and turned down a different corridor. It was, I was coming to understand, her version of warmth. The weeks found their shape. Mornings in the kitchen. Still, always, the mornings in the kitchen. The bread had become mine in some way I couldn't fully articulate. I woke up thinking about it, planning variations, asking Sable questions about temperature and timing that she answered with the patient pleasure of someone whose knowledge is finally being taken seriously. Dog had graduated to full paragraphs on occasion, which Petra told me in a low voice was exceptional, and that I should not mention it, or he would retreat back to eyebrows. Afternoons at the council table, working through the proceedings that had accumulated in my absence. The Eastern boundary discussion moved to resolution. A secondary dispute about seasonal migration routes required 3 days of careful negotiation, and one moment where I quoted something directly from memory and watched Dorian's carefully neutral expression flicker, briefly, into something that might have been admiration. Evenings were the strange time. The threshold hours when the day's work was done but the night hadn't quite committed itself. The house settled. The fire in the kitchen banked down. I often found myself in the small library room, the one with the amber light, working through documents, or simply sitting with the particular companionable silence of old books. Twice Adrian was there when I arrived. The first time I nearly left. He looked up from whatever he was reading and said, "You don't have to go," in a tone so matter-of-fact that leaving would have been more awkward than staying. So I stayed, and we sat at opposite sides of the room and read our separate things for an hour. And it was one of the most comfortable hours I had spent in years. The second time, I arrived first. When he came in and found me there, something in his expression shifted. A small recalibration, quickly controlled. He sat. We worked. At some point he said, without looking up, "The Eastern boundary language. Your resolution. The joint survey clause. How long had you been holding that?" "Since I read the Accords the first time," I said. 3 years ago. "And you waited 40 minutes before using it." "I wanted to understand the room first." He looked up then, the gray eyes, the careful attention. "Most people lead with what they know," he said. "Most people are performing competence," I said. I was trying to understand what was actually needed. A long pause. The amber light. "That's a different thing," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer, that look that felt like being read slowly, carefully, without distortion. And then he returned to his documents, and I returned to mine, and the room held both of us without requiring anything more than presence. But something had shifted. I felt it the way you feel a change in pressure. Not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable. The way weather announces itself before it arrives. It was Sable who said it out loud, because Sable noticed everything and had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was worth honesty. She said it one morning while we were waiting for the bread, standing at the kitchen window watching the early light come across the ridge. "He doesn't do that with people," she said. "Do what?" I asked, knowing. "Sit in rooms with them." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way she chose her ingredients, with attention, without waste. After his brother left, there was a disagreement, years ago, about the succession. He stopped, sitting with people, being in rooms without purpose. She paused. "He's in rooms with you." I looked at the ridge. The light was coming low and gold, the kind that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, or possibly exactly as significant as it actually is, and the trick is you can never quite tell. "We have work," I said. "Yes," Sable said, "and other things." She went back to the dough without elaboration, which was its own form of eloquence. That afternoon in the council room, when a particularly convoluted discussion about tributary rights reached the point where everyone was talking and no one was listening, I caught Adrian's eye across the table, and he was already looking at me, and something passed between us that had no name in treaty language and didn't need one. The discussion resolved 20 minutes later. I didn't look at him again for the rest of the session, which was its own form of honesty. That evening the library was amber and quiet, and I sat alone this time, and thought about rooms and the people you sit in them with, and the way some things grow slowly in the spaces between words, in the silences that are comfortable rather than cold, in the mornings that begin, before the house wakes and belong, in some indefinable way, to a specific kind of truth. The crisis came on a Thursday, the way most crises do, not announced, not dramatic in its arrival, simply present one morning where it had not been the night before. I woke to the sound of the house moving differently. There is a particular quality to a building's silence when the people inside it are awake and tense. Something compressed about it, a held-breath quality that communicates alarm more efficiently than any raised voice. I was dressed and in the corridor before I had consciously decided to be. And what I found there was Aaron, moving with the contained urgency of someone managing a situation that has not yet become a disaster, but is considering it seriously. The delegation from the Northern Outer Territories had sent a formal withdrawal notice overnight, not from the proceedings, from the accords entirely. 40 years of cooperative agreement, the structural foundation beneath every boundary discussion we had been having for 3 weeks, and they were threatening to remove themselves from it before the ink on our recent resolutions had properly dried. The reason, when I found it in the documentation Aaron pressed into my hands, was not about boundaries. It was about the succession question, the unresolved matter of Adrian's brother, whose name was Cale, who had left Velmore 6 years ago after a disagreement about leadership that had never been formally addressed and had therefore grown, in the way unaddressed things do, into something much larger than its original shape. The Outer Territories had aligned themselves with Cale's position. They were using the withdrawal as leverage. "This is not a boundary problem," I said to Aaron in the corridor. "No," he said. "It's a family problem dressed in territorial language." "Also, yes." He looked at me with the expression I had come to associate with him giving me more credit than he was going to say out loud. "The council convenes in an hour. Adrian needs—" He paused, choosing. He needs someone who can see both layers at once. The council room was different that morning. The same table, same chairs, same documents. But the atmosphere had changed the way a familiar room changes when something important has happened in it, the air carrying a memory the furniture didn't have before. Calla was rigid with the particular tension of someone who processes threat by becoming very still. Dorian had 3 documents open simultaneously. Isolde's careful neutrality had sharpened into something that looked, if you knew how to read her, like concern. Adrian stood at the window when I arrived, not sitting, standing with his back to the room, looking out at the ridge, and I understood from this alone that the night had been difficult, that the broth had been made early, and the sleep had not come, or had come and been full of the kind of content that is worse than wakefulness. He turned when I entered. The gray eyes found me immediately, and in them I saw something I had not seen there before. Not weakness, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that they've stopped noticing it's heavy until someone else looks at it directly. I sat down. I opened the withdrawal notice. I read it again, carefully, the way you read something when you're not looking for what it says, but for what it's trying not to say. "This isn't about the accords," I said, when the room had assembled. "The accords are the form. The content is a question that's been waiting 6 years for someone to answer it directly." Silence. "Cale's position," I continued, "was never formally responded to. Not refuted, not accommodated. Set aside, which is what institutions do when the question is too personal to address institutionally." I looked at the withdrawal notice. The Outer Territories are holding this up as a mirror. They're not asking for territorial concessions. They're asking whether this leadership is willing to address what it has been avoiding. I felt Adrian's attention from across the room the way you feel heat. Directional, specific, impossible to pretend you don't notice. "You can't negotiate your way out of a personal question with territorial language," I said. "It will keep coming back in different forms until it's answered in the form it's actually in." The room was very quiet. Calla said, "Are you suggesting the Alpha King address his brother's grievances publicly?" "I'm suggesting," I said carefully, "that the proceedings cannot move forward on a foundation that has a crack in it. You can document over the crack. You can build carefully around it. Eventually, the weight becomes too much." I stopped. I had said enough. More than enough, probably. More than my role strictly required. More than was comfortable. More than was safe in a room full of people who had been navigating this particular silence for 6 years and had learned not to name it. Adrian said nothing. He turned back to the window. The session recessed. He found me in the kitchen that evening. Not in the library, the kitchen, which was where I had gone instinctively. The way you go to the place that feels most like ground when everything else feels like weather. The evening meal was long finished. Sable and Petra and Dog had gone. The fire was low, and the room smelled of the day's cooking, bread and herbs, and the warm stone smell that the kitchen accumulated and released slowly, like something breathing. I was making nothing. I was standing at the counter with my hands flat on the surface, just present, just in the room. He came in and stood for a moment without speaking. I did not turn around. The fire made its small sounds. Cale and I disagreed about what this place was for, he said, finally. Not explaining, placing. The way you put something heavy down carefully because you've been holding it a long time and need to set it somewhere real. He thought leadership was authority. I thought it was responsibility. We were both right about part of it, and certain we were right about all of it, the way young men are. I waited. I let him leave without saying that. He paused. 6 years of silence is its own kind of answer. It just isn't the one I meant to give. I turned around then, because this deserved being faced. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Not defensive, just held together. The posture of someone being honest and bracing for it slightly. In the low firelight, he looked less like a king, and more like someone who had been a person for a long time before the title arrived, and was still, in certain moments, more person than title. Write to him, I said. I have, 3 times. Write to him differently, not as Alpha to his brother, as a person who was certain of something and has spent 6 years becoming less certain. I held his gaze. The outer territories don't want a concession. They want proof that the leadership here is capable of that kind of honesty. He looked at me for a long moment, the gray eyes doing their slow, careful work. You came here to discuss boundary law, he said. I came here and burned the bread, I said. And then I stayed. The edge of something moved across his face, that almost smile I had been cataloging for weeks, the one that lived just at the border of his usual expression, appearing rarely enough to mean something when it did. Yes, he said quietly. You did. He wrote the letter that night. I know because Aaron told me the next morning, with the careful, pleased expression of someone watching a long calculation finally resolve. The letter went by fast courier to the outer territories, and to Cale himself, wherever Cale was. Somewhere in the far eastern reaches, living a life that had diverged from Velmore's story and then been pulled back into it by the gravity of unfinished things. The outer territories did not withdraw. The proceedings resumed. The Eastern Boundary Resolution was finalized 11 days later, signed by all parties, witnessed, and documented. The Joint Survey Clause embedded in the formal language so that future disputes had somewhere to go that wasn't silence. Dorian shook my hand with both of his, which Calla told me afterward he had done exactly twice in her memory, and both times involved something significant. Isolde, in the most extravagant display of warmth I had yet witnessed from her, said my name without any other words attached to it, which from her was a complete sentence. Cale came to Velmore 3 weeks after the letter. I was not in the room when they met. That was right. Some things require privacy, not because they are shameful, but because they are too real for witnesses. What I know is that they were together for 4 hours, and that when Adrian came to find me afterward, something in him had changed in the way things change when a weight is finally, actually, set down. We were in the kitchen. It was morning. We had come back around to morning, the way time does when something is finally finished. He sat at the kitchen table, which he had never done before. Always the counter, always standing, always some version of ready to leave. Sitting was different. Sitting was staying. I put bread in front of him without being asked. He broke it the way he always did, without ceremony, and ate it like it was something to be grateful for. "Kale will come back," he said. "Not to Velmore permanently. We're past that. But the distance will be chosen now, instead of fallen into." "That's different," I said. "Yes." He looked at the bread. "You were right, about the crack in the foundation." "Aaron would have gotten there," I said. "Aaron was being careful with me." He looked up. "You weren't." "No," I agreed. "Why not?" I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Because I came here as something I wasn't supposed to be, and it turned out to be what was needed. I think that makes you less cautious about being exactly what you are, even when it's inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning light was coming across the ridge, the clear, early kind that doesn't try to be dramatic and is therefore more beautiful than the dramatic kind. "Stay," he said. Just that. One word, plain and functional. The way his name was plain and functional, not trying too hard, meaning exactly what it said. "In what capacity?" I said, because I needed to hear it said clearly. "Both," he said. "All of them. The table and the kitchen and the library and whatever else you decide to be in this house." He held my gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to choose one thing. I'm asking you to stay as all of them." I looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning light, with flour that I hadn't bothered to brush off still on my hands. "All right," I said. That is not quite where the story ends, because stories don't end in single moments. They end in the accumulation of what comes after. What came after? Calla eventually admitted over a meal 3 months later that I was the most useful person she had argued with in years. Dorian gave me access to the archive, which was his highest expression of trust, and which I accepted accordingly. Isolde, during a long session on winter provisions, laughed once at something I said, and Calla made a small sound of pure shock that Isolde pretended not to hear. Sable went on to apprentice properly with a baker in the Eastern Settlement, which had been her quiet hope for years, and which the resources of Velmore were able to make real. She left on a bright autumn morning with a pack on her back, and the particular posture of someone walking toward something they've been patient about for a long time. She hugged me at the gate and said, "The bread is yours now." And I understood she meant more than the bread. Dog retired. At the small gathering in the kitchen on his last evening, he made a speech that was 11 words long and contained more warmth than most people manage in 11 paragraphs. Aaron wept quietly into his cup and denied it. Kale came to Velmore twice in the year that followed. The visits were not easy, exactly, but they were real. 2 people relearning the shape of each other across the distance that 6 years had made, finding that some things had been preserved by the separation, and some things needed to be built new. Adrian was quieter after each visit, but differently quiet than before. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of someone processing something that is difficult and necessary, and slowly becoming less like a wound. The eastern boundaries held. The joint survey was completed in the spring, both parties signing the final measurements with the particular dignity of people who have found a way to be right together instead of right alone. And the mornings remained. Adrian made the broth when he couldn't sleep. I made the bread when I could. On the mornings when both things happened, the kitchen held us the way it had held generations before us, without ceremony, without requiring anything other than presence, warm with the evidence of what it means to feed people you are responsible for and have chosen. One morning, early in the 2nd year, he came in to find the bread already made. The best loaf I had produced, the crust exactly right, the kind that sings when you tap it. And he sat down at the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at me, and the gray eyes were doing the thing they did, that slow and thorough attention that had terrified me once, and now felt like being known. "You've stopped burning things," he said. "Most things," I said. He broke the bread. The crust sang. Outside, the morning came across the ridge the way it always did, clear and unhurried, certain of itself, asking nothing from anyone. Simply present, simply light. Simply the beginning of another day in a house that had learned, as all living things do eventually, that what endures is not what is perfect. It is what stays.